It hardly seems like a year since I was in the Holy Land, and I'd like to start by saying thank you yet again to those of you whose generosity helped me to have the most incredible week of my life. It is somewhere I've always wanted to go, and I make no apologies for saying that the reason I haven't been previously is because the tourist industry in the Holy Land is largely controlled by the Israelis, and I do have major reservations about their human rights record towards the Palestinian Arabs. But reflecting on this, I think of something a Christian friend at work said to me. Don't confuse God's Israel with the state of Israel. And that I actually found very helpful throughout my visit there. I will from time to time refer to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I'm going to avoid particularly commenting on it. And I think, and I'm not trying to sound flippant here, that's partly because having been there, I probably understand the conflict even less than I did before I went. What is clear is that while there might be individuals working together to try and bring about reconciliation, the political elements on both sides are completely intransigent. And that intransigence is fueled by almost paranoid fear and venomous hatred. And there's no more literally concrete sign of that paranoia than the West Bank barrier that divides the Israeli and Palestinian territories. For the Orthodox Israeli Jews, the bottom line is that this mosque, which is such a characteristic feature of the Jerusalem skyline, has to come down and be replaced with their temple. The Palestinian Muslim response to this is, try that, and you might just ignite the spark that starts World War III. And we arrived in time for Palm Sunday, and we stayed at Tantur Ecumenical Institute, which is a college run by the Catholic Church. This was my view from my window. That's actually Bethlehem. It looks a bit of a dump from there, but it is actually a very pleasant little town. Sorry, no bad joke intended. I have to say that Tantur was the first place where we were confronted with signs of the conflict. It's the only place I've ever stayed that had air raid shelters. So on Palm Sunday morning, we visited the temple site. Psalm 122 has always been one of my favourite psalms, and those opening words, I was glad when they said unto me, we will go into the house of the Lord, have taken on a whole new dimension since we went there. We went to see the Dome of the Rock, and we then visited the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall as it's become known. You can see there the men's and the women's sections. They are kept separate. Of course, non-Jews weren't allowed there at all at one time, but you are encouraged now to go and pray there. The men have to keep their heads covered, so if you don't have a hat, they'll give you a yarmulke, the characteristic Jewish skull cap. I had an amazing experience here. I remember going to the wall to pray and putting my hand on it and having the most incredible sense of God's love just flooding through me. I can't describe it, but I came away with a feeling of peace, the depth of which I've never experienced before, and which stayed with me through the day. In the afternoon we went to Bethphage, where Jesus stayed before making his final journey to Jerusalem, and we all gathered at this rather beautiful little Franciscan church. We were given palms there, and then we set off along the lower slope of the Mount of Olives for the 2-mile walk to Jerusalem, which takes you past the dominant Flavid Church, where, according to Luke, Jesus wept over Jerusalem. There does now seem to be a terribly prophetic echo for Jerusalem in our time in his words, if thou hadst known, even thou at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. I couldn't help thinking about that as we passed the church. Shortly after that we passed the Garden of Gethsemane and crossed the Kidron Valley before going into Jerusalem itself through the Lion Gate, which is almost certainly the one by which Jesus would have entered the city. There were 15,000 of us on the walk. Pretty much all, I would say, from the churches of the Western Christian traditions, because the Eastern Orthodox weren't going to be celebrating Easter until the following week. And I think I felt a renewed sense of what the word Catholic means, seeing all those different nationalities together, all there because of their faith in Jesus. Well, Monday saw us travelling north to Nazareth, where we visited the Basilica of the Annunciation, which is built over the remains of what is believed to be the house where the Archangel Gabriel appeared to Our Lady. Whether it is or it isn't doesn't seem to me to matter very much. Going there is still a fulfilling experience, and I think that what we all felt was that by approaching the Holy House prayerfully, it was still very much a window onto heaven. In the afternoon we went out on a boat on the Sea of Galilee. They looked after us very well on the boat. They even hoisted the Union flag for us and gave us a demonstration of the fishing technique that would have been used in Jesus' time. He didn't catch anything, by the way. I think it's worth just mentioning here that the Sea of Galilee has been disastrously overfished in its time, to the extent that in 2010 the government imposed a 2-year fishing ban to allow the lake's fish stocks to replenish themselves. Unlike a lot of what I've seen of the Middle East, it is very beautiful around the Sea of Galilee. That's the view from our accommodation, which was a hostel at Tiberias run by a small Catholic community. It doesn't really do the scenery justice, but it gives you an idea. One of my favourite hymns has always been Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, and we sang it that night at evensong. It was quite exciting to be able to sing it, as the second verse of the hymn says, beside the Syrian Sea, and experience the calmness of the place which is referred to in the third verse. While I have always loved the hymn, it now has a whole new significance for me when I sing it. Tiberias, again, is a pleasant city built originally by Herod Antipas in 20 AD. It's interesting to note that the people who came with him and settled there were described by the 1st century historian Josephus as a promiscuous rabble. Tuesday it took us up to Capernaum, where, according to Matthew's Gospel, Jesus went to live after he left his parents' home in Nazareth, and where he called St. Peter and St. Andrew to be his disciples. There really isn't a great deal to see there. It doesn't appear to have been a very big town, and what is left of it is mostly in ruins. But there are the remains of a synagogue, which is presumably the one Jesus would have attended, and there are also the ruins of what are believed to be the house of St. Peter's mother, and this has a very beautiful modern Catholic church built over it. This church is looked after by the Franciscan order, who were given permission in the 13th century by the then governing Muslim authorities to act as custodians for all the major Christian sites in the Holy Land, which they still do to this day. From Capernaum we went to Migdal, home of Mary Magdalene. Again, there isn't much to see there except ruins, but there is another very beautiful church, the Duc in Altum church. Duc in Altum means put out into the deep water, and this is where Jesus is believed to have caused the miraculous catch of fish. We were given permission by the Franciscan custodians of the church to celebrate Mass there, and we were lucky enough to be able to use the high altar, which, because of the area's connection with St. Peter, is shaped, as you can see, like a 1st century fishing boat. We had 2 visits on Wednesday, first of all to the hill fortress of Masada, built by Herod as a fortification against the Romans. It's a massive structure, and one of the fascinating things about it is that the buildings seem to have been put up without using any mortar. It seems that the builders of the time were so skillful at putting buildings together that they didn't need it. The other interesting thing about it is that its strategic position is such that it's almost unassailable, and the Romans, unusually, never succeeded in capturing it. From Masada we went to the Dead Sea, which is in fact gradually shrinking. We had the opportunity to bathe in it, which I decided not to try and do. You supposedly can't drown in it because of the buoyancy that the extremely salty water provides, but I thought that if anybody could manage to drown in it, I could, so I didn't try and put the theory to the test. So I went for lunch and did a bit of shopping, and after lunch we went to Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. That's the cave where the scrolls were first accidentally found by a shepherd boy. I've always found it remarkable, given the significance of the scrolls for us as Christians, that just as the news of the birth of Jesus was first given to shepherds, it was a shepherd who first found the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a place where you really do feel you're taking a step back in time, because that landscape can hardly have changed since the days when the Essene community lived at Qumran. That brings us to Maundy Thursday. We spent the day in Bethlehem, that is Manger Square in the centre of the town, and we visited the Church of the Nativity, which stands on the site of what is believed to be the stable where Jesus was born. Now this is an Orthodox church which is shared by 9 different Orthodox denominations. It seems that they don't all get along very well together, because the police are regularly called to stop punch-ups between different factions of the clergy who staff the place. My old organ teacher always said he found that the Orthodox made the Catholic Church look like the Salvation Army, and I think the Church of the Nativity is possibly the best example of what he meant. At the risk of sounding a bit of a Philistine, I have to say I found it all a bit over the top, really. Well, we came next to one of the more harrowing parts of our trip. We were taken to the Ida Refugee Village on the outskirts of Bethlehem, which is inhabited by mainly Syrian refugees, some Muslim, some Christian. I haven't got any photographs of the place because we were asked to be careful what we took pictures of. We had a talk from one of the community leaders, and it was quite clear that they're very much victimized by the Israeli authorities. It's regularly attacked by Israeli soldiers, and it's difficult not to conclude that this is often just for the fun of it. According to the United Nations, it's the most tear-gassed place in the world. And the worst thing we saw was we were taken to a street corner where there's a memorial to a 13-year-old boy who was shot by an Israeli sniper from one of the watchtowers on the West Bank barrier. Apparently this guy had a new rifle and wanted to test its accuracy, so he'd chosen this boy as his target. After this we went for lunch to the home of some Syrian Orthodox Christians who gave us a talk about their life there. It's sadly clear that our brothers and sisters in Israel don't have an easy time of it, and the family we met had been particularly harassed through land seizure laws that were in operation there. They'd lost an olive farm which had been their livelihood. So if you want a couple of thoughts to pray about, you might want to think about the situation of the refugees in the Ida village and of our fellow believers throughout the Holy Land. In the afternoon, the focus of our visit shifted towards looking forward to Easter. We started by visiting Shepherd's Field on the outskirts of Bethlehem, which was where the shepherds were believed to have been watching their sheep when the news of Jesus' birth was brought to them. There's a cave there which has been turned into a chapel, where we had a short service before going back to Jerusalem for evening mass at the Ecce Homo Catholic Church, which is on the Temple Mount, just behind the Dome of the Rock. It was quite interesting that the priest who celebrated Mass, who was an American Jesuit, prayed for the Archbishop of Canterbury. And afterwards I thanked him and asked him if he'd done it because we were there. He said it had been nice to pray for Rowan Williams when there were Anglicans present, but they do in fact pray for him at every Mass at the church. Well, it was a beautiful evening and there was a fantastic sunset. That's the Dome of the Rock again. I'm afraid the photo doesn't really do justice to how magnificent it looked. So from Ecce Homo Church we went to the Garden of Gethsemane for a prayer vigil. Obviously there were a lot of people around, but I managed to find a quiet place where there wasn't anybody else, and those of you who asked me to pray for your particular intentions, I prayed for them there. I have to say that it was a real privilege to be able to do that for you. What I didn't know until I went to the Holy Land was that Gethsemane means olive press. And what does an olive press do? It presses the oil out of the olives. And I couldn't help equating that with the picture of Jesus in Luke's Gospel praying in the garden at what must have been a terrifying time for him. You'll remember the Gospel says, and being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was as it were great drops of blood falling down to the ground. There's probably a sermon there if I can only think a decent one up. Well, that was a wonderful start to the Easter Triduum, and we began Good Friday with an open-air morning service. Now, I have to say, people have this idea that it's baking hot all the time in the Middle East, which is a misconception, and one we were all suffering on account of because we'd all taken mostly summer clothes, and that morning it was really cold, so we were standing having our service with blankets and duvets wrapped around us. Just something to bear in mind should you ever think about going to the Holy Land around Easter time. After breakfast we visited the Holocaust memorial site of Yad Vashem at Jerusalem. Again, it's quite a harrowing experience. Probably for me the most poignant part of the exhibition there is the Children's Memorial. What they have there is a hall where the names of all the children who were murdered by the Germans are read out continuously. There are over a million names, and they have a single candle burning, but by an arrangement of mirrors there's a reflection of the candle for each child who died. There's also a garden there, the garden of the righteous among the nations, where non-Jews who helped Jewish people during the Third Reich are honoured. One of the people who are commemorated there is Oskar Schindler. We had a short service at what's called the Wagon Memorial. This is actually a wagon from one of the trains that the Germans used to transport Jews to Auschwitz. Now, I hope, like any other right-thinking person, I do believe that we mustn't ever forget the Holocaust and all the other suffering caused by the Third Reich. But I have to confess that I found it quite difficult to reconcile this memorial with its very graphic depictions of what the Jews suffered under the Germans, with the Israelis' own human rights record towards the Palestinian Arabs. It's one of the paradoxes about the Holy Land that confront you at regular intervals. In the afternoon we walked the Via Dolorosa, which traces the route Jesus took through Jerusalem to Golgotha. This is the basis of the Stations of the Cross devotion, and I used it as a time to pray for your intentions again. It's very moving, and I'm sure next Easter the Passion narrative is just going to seem so much more alive for my having done the Via Dolorosa. I beg your pardon, that should be indeed this Easter. It starts at this chapel, which is on the site of the pavement, Gabbatha, where Pilate condemned Jesus to death. And you walk around 3/4 of a mile through the various stations, each of which has a chapel where we stop to pray. Eventually, you come out into this square, which is believed to be the site of Calvary. And we found a corner there to say the Good Friday Liturgy. That's our group there. If you wonder why I'm not saying much about how the experience felt, it's because it's just impossible to convey it. Just nearby is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is built on the site where Jesus is believed to have been buried. Like the Church of the Nativity, it's an Orthodox church which is administered by several different Eastern Christian denominations. I'm afraid when I was there it was horribly overcrowded, but I did manage to photograph this chapel, which marks the site of the tomb. I noticed that a lot of people had left pieces of paper there with prayer requests, so I left the ones you'd given me there. So that was Good Friday. On our way back to our accommodation, we gave a lift to this Orthodox priest. Now, I'm not sure how we found out where he wanted to go because he didn't speak any English, but we gathered he was called Polycarp because that was all he would say whenever any of us spoke to him. We had what turned into a very packed Holy Saturday, starting with a visit to Herod the Great's summer palace at Herodium. That's the palace itself, and it stands on top of this hill. You'll notice the hill looks rather artificial, and that's because it is. Herod particularly wanted his summer residence to be up there, but he wanted to be able to see Jerusalem from it, and it was pointed out to him that he wouldn't be able to. So he said, well, you'd better make the hill a bit higher. So that's literally what they did. That's the view from the top. Off in the background there you can see the hills of the Judean Wilderness, where we believe Jesus spent his 40 days and 40 nights before beginning his ministry. Later in the morning we walked to St. George's Monastery near Jericho. It's a Greek Orthodox monastery and it's a fantastic piece of building engineering, which you can see just from this photograph. We didn't spend a long time there because sadly we weren't made very welcome. I haven't had a lot to do with Greek Orthodox monks, but the ones I have met have universally been some of the rudest, most miserable people I've ever come across. And these guys were in a class of their own. It was quite clear that they thought this pack of idiots had turned up with the express purpose of ruining their day, so we didn't hang around. The fitter among us walked the 3-mile path from the monastery down to Jericho, where we met at Herod's winter palace. There it is. It's obviously been an impressive structure in its day. Our bus was parked near a supermarket where we had coffee, and while we were there a man arrived on this camel to do his shopping. I thought the camel looked so contented, and I couldn't resist taking a photograph of it. Also, just nearby there is the Mount of Temptation, which by tradition is the one the devil told Jesus to jump off. We came then to one of the most moving and special parts of the whole trip. We went to Qasr el-Yahud, which is the place by the River Jordan where we believe St. John baptized Jesus. The Jordan itself is a bit of an anticlimax, if I'm honest, because it's been reduced over the centuries to not much more than a muddy stream. But we renewed our baptismal vows there, and we were all anointed with water from the river. One of the most amazing things that happened during our whole trip was that just as we'd finished doing this, the dove that you can see there flew down and landed on that log. I think it's fair to say that it took our breath away as a whole group. Perhaps the most special moment of all was when this Filipino girl who had not been baptized approached one of the priests in our group and asked if he would baptize her, which he duly did. I felt that was the most wonderful privilege for both of them. Well, being Anglicans, we couldn't let a trip to the Holy Land go by without a visit to St. George's Cathedral, so we celebrated Easter there on the Sunday morning by attending the Pontifical High Mass celebrated by the Archbishop of Jerusalem. Jerusalem has 4 archbishops: Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, and then ours. It was quite interesting because parts of the service were in Arabic, but we did use the good old English hymnal for the hymns, so I felt very much at home there. It's a lovely building, which is well worth a visit if you're ever in Jerusalem, and they clearly maintain a very high standard of public worship. And that brought a very packed and emotional roller coaster of a week to a magnificent conclusion. There is so much more I could tell you, so do feel free to ask me any questions you have whenever you next see me. Perhaps as a prayerful conclusion to this talk, you might like to say Psalm 22. Thank you.